Hey, Dr. Solomon, can you hear me?
George, how you doing? Can you hear me?
I can.
Does
Fantastic.
that sound okay?
That sounds great. It is
Aloha.
aloha. I just want to say thank you for taking a moment to spend some time with me.
Hey, I appreciate your interest. Are you kidding?
I'm not kidding, actually, no.
Real
Fan
early in the morning there, isn't it?
It is early. It's about 7.
Yeah,
I'm an early riser though.
so am
I
I.
it just seems better that way. I think that's the way the world tended here. Let me fix my camera a little bit. All right, what do you say we just jump right into this bad boy?
Sure, you bet.
Okay. Well, first off, everybody, welcome to the True Life Podcast. I have an amazing guest today, Dr. David Solomon. He's the author of several books. He is his new book, The Seven Deadly Sins: How Sin Influenced the West from the Middle Ages to the Modern Era. He's the director of undergraduate research and creative activity at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. He is an expert on the Flintstones, um, amongst many other things. And I just want to start off by telling everybody this book is well worth your time. It is so dense. It's got so much good information, and it crosses like millennia. It seems like it goes way back to mysticism and so many contemporary philosophers, and it ties so much together. And I just want to say thank you, Doctor, for leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for people to follow the ideas of those that inspired you. I think that's a great way to start a book and allow people to see where you came from. Would you like to
Yeah.
maybe introduce a little bit more about yourself or
Yeah, well,
about the
thank
book?
you, George, and thanks for having me. And I love that metaphor of the breadcrumbs because that really is kind of the way that my own mind works. So, but yeah, as you say, I'm here in Newport News, Virginia, down near Virginia Beach. Came here 5 years ago to open up the Office of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity after about 2 decades as a professor of English. And my area of specialization is medieval and Renaissance literature, religion, and culture. I've written now 4 books. The most recent one is this book on the seven deadly sins. And I do love the Flintstones.
What do you think it was about Grand Poobah? They were like the Loyal Order of the Water Buffalo. Did you
Yes,
remember
they
that
were
part?
very good. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I aspire to be the Grand Poobah
I
someday.
think,
Someday I will be the Grand Poobah.
well, if you're the Grand Poobah, then I want to be a Loyal Order of the Water Buffalo. So I wanted to maybe start off with, I thought maybe we could start off with the introduction. Again, the,
Sure.
the introduction that you wrote was really well done. And it was almost like 2 books in one. It was like a little bit of an autobiography.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important to thoroughly understand one's ideas. You must understand where they came from. So could you tell us a little bit about the introduction?
Yeah, sure. I do think that it's helpful to know that about the author. And there's some debate in the academic world about that. And of course, I was raised and trained in the academy to think that you don't bring in the personal in an academic study. And then Stephen Greenblatt wrote a book called Hamlet in Purgatory. I don't know when it came out. I forget. It must have been the 1990s, maybe. And in that book, he sort of established the reason for him writing it in the introduction with an incredible personal story about his own life. And I was really struck by that. And I said, "Oh, you can do that?" And of course, eventually then realized that, well, it's my book. I can do whatever I want. But I think it is helpful to understand how I got interested in this topic. I grew up in the Bronx in New York, raised a Jew, a faithful Jew, a cultural Jew more than a religious Jew, more interested in bagels than Torah, and probably still am, which is probably my downfall. And but I was very, very interested in religion as a child, and was very faithful to my Jewish faith. Ended up being bar mitzvahed from an Orthodox synagogue in the Bronx, not because my family was Orthodox, but only because that was the synagogue in the neighborhood. And up until the time I was really about 12 years old, a lot of my teachers thought I was eventually going to be a rabbi. And a colleague of mine pointed out a couple of years ago that I am a rabbi means teacher, and that's what I do. When my grandmother died when I was 13, that kind of changed the earth under my feet. And in many ways, if I didn't lose the faith, I started questioning my faith and questioning the nature of faith in general. I knew nothing about anything really other than Judaism at that point. I went to school at a public school in the Bronx, and directly across the street, not 50 yards from our front door, was Our Lady of Refuge, a parochial school in the Bronx. I had no idea what went on over there, other than the fact that they wore uniforms and they got different holidays off than we did. But then when I started college, I went to Fordham University, which was not far from where we were living. We had since moved to New Jersey, and always wanted to go to Fordham. And at Fordham, of course, got a great Jesuit Catholic education, and theology courses were required. And so I remember sitting in the Foundations of Christian Theology course freshman year with Father Baldwin, man with the largest ears of any human being I've ever met. And it was me and 29 Catholics. And I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. I had no idea what was going on. I will never forget the day that we discussed the Trinity. I was completely baffled. And I still have the textbook from that class sitting on my shelf here in the office. It was a formative moment. From there, then, the following year, I took another required general education course, and we read John Milton's Paradise Lost, and that changed my life. He was able to describe not only the narrative of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, and then the redemption, but also with a depth into these characters where we got to understand what was going on in Adam's mind, what made him decide to eat the fruit when Eve offered it to him, what was going on in Satan's mind, why did he fall from heaven? And so all of that kind of grew then into this incredible self-training, more or less, in Catholicism and the history of the Catholic Church, which I then pursued some more in graduate school as a medievalist. Wrote my doctoral dissertation on Jesuits in the 16th century, and got very involved in the world of Catholic study and Catholic academics. And that's where I'm at now. And I still teach. I teach a course on the Bible as literature, which I'm teaching this fall, and teach a course on heaven and hell and all sorts of topics like that. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of how I got sort of set on this path. Of course, there's a lot of stories in that introduction, which I'm sure that you probably picked up on that I could relate, of specific things that happened, which were really, if not formative, really kind of ground shaking to me, changed my life.
Yeah, I often see a similarity in people's past, and it is that questioning faith that begins people's path. And I live by this idea that has really come to build in my soul lately, that is like our greatest tragedies are our greatest gifts. And it's so hard when those tragedies happen to you to understand that that's your gift.
It is.
But if you, like you said, I wish you could say I got goosebumps when you said, when she passed away, it's like it made me question my faith. Like that's God like reaching out to you and say, listen, I need you. I need you to start learning, pay attention, and it reminds me too of, without giving away too much of the introduction, you told a story about an elderly man with his cane going up and practicing. And could you share, would that be okay if you shared that story?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So at my very small Orthodox synagogue where I went to Hebrew school every day after public school, we had a very small contingent of old men who would come in for evening services as we were leaving from Hebrew school around 5 o'clock when the sun would set. And oftentimes I would be sitting on the stairs there waiting before I left. And this old man, I wish all these years later I knew his name. I'm not sure I ever knew his name. I'm not sure I ever actually talked with him, but he came every night for evening services, and he had a hunchback. He was stooped. And Jewish practice when you enter into the synagogue is to reach up on the door sash and touch the mezuzah and kiss the mezuzah with your lips and to your hand and your hand to the mezuzah. Well, he really struggled to do this as hunched over as he was. The mezuzah is usually about 3/4 of the way up the door sash, and he was profoundly hunched. And I would watch him standing in that doorway each night, and he would sort of inch his way up the door sash with his fingers until he could reach the mezuzah. It may have taken him 10 minutes, but he did it. It was part of his faith. It was part of his belief system. And it was part of the reason that I became sort of intrigued by the whole nature of faith in general. What would drive someone to do that on an everyday basis? It wasn't as if someone was standing there giving him any kind of confirmation or affirmation of his activities. He did it because he believed, and it made him feel better and more full inside. And I think you're right. Some of the greatest tragedies we see as the greatest gifts, we need the distance oftentimes to notice. And bringing that up, I'm thinking about how preoccupied many of us are right now with what's going on in Ukraine and the horrible things that are happening. And God, I hope that someday the people who are experiencing this incredible tragedy see it as a gift on the other end, and that things will work out. But sometimes, and I suppose that is the funny nature of faith is believing when belief seems ridiculous.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's it's so inspiring to hear the story about that gentleman, and then have the man that you saw inspires another man in Hawaii, 60 years later or 50 years later. It's that kind of power. That guy's probably smiling right now, or
Yeah.
whatnot. A few points that you brought up is, I just want to tell everybody how well documented the book is. And getting back to this idea of breadcrumbs, I was not even aware of Paul Valerie or the prophetic nature of D.H. Lawrence. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm a sort of a devotee of two particular writers that kind of follow through and weave themselves through the entire book. And one is the French symbolist poet Paul Valery, which some people know from his poetry, and some of his poetry is really outstanding, but not an easy read. He is not Robert Frost. He is incredibly difficult, even in translation. But Valery, who lived at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, also wrote an incredible amount of prose. In fact, he kept notebooks throughout his life, and he wrote, I think there are 287 notebooks that have never been translated. Well, they've been translated, but they only have been available for a long time in facsimile in the French. Some of them have been translated now. And he always thought that his greatest thought went into the notebooks. But the reason for my using him and then D.H. Lawrence, the great English novelist who also wrote incredible essays, is both of these men were commentators. They were what we today call public intellectuals. They were able to work in their own discipline. Lawrence primarily as a novelist, Valery primarily as a poet, but they also had the ability to write and comment about what was going on in the world, what was going on with humanity, what they saw as the future. And so I really mine both of their work for these little kernels that kind of help me get through the discussion of sin in the book.
Yeah, it's I've often wondered, maybe you could put a little light on this. What is it about spirituality that allows it to transcend time from the present to the past into the future?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think it's because we are talking about spirituality and not religion. And they're two different things, right? I mean, right now, at this point in my life, after decades of studying various religious traditions and and experiencing things in religious traditions of all kinds, from sitting in sweat lodges in Native American on a Native American reservation in South Dakota to, attending a Hindu temple, all of those things. I mean, I describe myself now as more of a Judist, right? I was a combination of being a Jew and a Buddhist, because I really have adopted a spiritual nature more than a religious nature. And so I think that spirituality does transcend time, whereas religion tends to be a little bit more constrained about time and even place, right? I mean, are you a Roman Catholic? Yes. Okay. Well, are you a Second Vatican Catholic, or are you pre-Vatican? There are very sort of pigeonholed ways that religion will try to narrow us into a little bit of a tight spot. And I think if we look at ourselves as spiritual human beings, that gets us out of that danger of being stuck in that pigeonhole.
That's a great way to put it. It's these labels that they continue to foster the hobgoblin of small-mindedness, right?
Absolutely. I mean, just look at all the conflict, the conflict around the world, which so much of it is based on labels.
Yeah.
I mean, even again, not to belabor it, but to go back to what's going on in the Ukraine, to label the Ukraine and Russia and say that, well, this imaginary arbitrary line divides the two countries. And the labeling is what always bothered me about Sigmund Freud. Is Freud loves to label people and put them in a little bit of a tight spot. It's what the diagnostic manual does today in many ways, which is why in the book I really do instead embrace more of a Jungian approach. I really like Carl Jung's psychology, and have done a lot with his archetypal work, and think that is a lot more usable to us as moderns, because it allows me to look at myself, Jung does, and say, okay, I'm a little screwed up and there's a problem there, but I can fix it. Freud tends to say, you're screwed up and you're kind of screwed. That's just going to be the way that it is. And there's no real way to get out of that. And that seems like a no-win situation to me.
Yeah. Looking back on it, it kind of explains why Freud was the way he was. Like that's his, he was
Yeah.
Diagnosing himself, I think.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
In a weird way, just to take it off, you'd said about like the DSM and all these things in there. Like I have the DSM, and I think it's fun to read in a way. Like the way I read it is like a bunch of people getting around and like, who I don't like? These people. We should try to get rid of them. In a weird way.
Robert Burton's great work in the 17th century, The Anatomy of Melancholy?
I don't know that.
The Anatomy of Melancholy could be labeled as sort of one of the earliest psychology books. It's almost a precursor to the DSM. And The Anatomy of Melancholy is this big, thick book. And it is based on one particular question. Burton wants to answer the question, why are we depressed? Why are we melancholic as a species? And one of my favorite sections of it is where he comes out and says that we're depressed because Adam ate the fruit, and we're still really kind of bummed about that. And famously, Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson of the English Dictionary, supposedly had kept a copy of Burton's book on his nightstand and would read a little bit of it every night. It's very interesting.
I'm definitely gonna have to check it out. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on Jung. Like it's in your book too. You do some work with the shadow. I think in when we start talking about pride, which is the first sin that we're talking about, you do talk about Jung and the shadow. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that to my audience?
Sure. So, I mean, if you're not familiar with Jungian psychology, part of Jung's theories is that each of us has an aspect of ourselves that he calls the shadow self. And this isn't necessarily entirely negative. It is something which we need to explore in ourselves, and which may uncover things that we are uncomfortable with, uncomfortable dealing with. But until we deal with them, we can't progress on the road to what Jung calls individuation, where we really realize and understand ourself and who we are. And the best example of the shadow self is a fantastic scene in The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke has to go down into the cave, and he feels apprehensive about it. He doesn't feel good about it. Yoda tells him that, he probably shouldn't go. And Luke famously starts to put on his belt with his lightsaber, and Yoda says, you won't need any weapons down there. They'll be of no use to you. And he goes into the cave, which is a Jungian device, and he has to confront his shadow self. And in The Empire Strikes Back, his shadow self shows up in the form of Darth Vader, who, of course, eventually we learn is his father. And he has to fight Vader in a lightsaber battle in the cave. He finally cuts off Vader's head, and when the head rolls on the ground, the mask disappears and the face is Luke's. So what he's got to deal with, the shadow self, is him. The shadow self is us. It's the things that in us that we don't want to admit. I don't want to admit that I am a prideful person. But until I do that, I can't transcend that point and get up to a more advanced level of who I can be as a human being.
That's a great point and a great metaphor. It makes me. I was talking to Simon Critchley a week ago, and we were talking.
I love his work.
Oh, that
Great
I
philosopher.
think he might be. He's probably my favorite philosopher.
He's
and
terrific. Yeah, he really is.
He is so well read and so
Yeah.
funny and so deep. Like, I feel like if I read one or two sentences, there's like 5 jokes in there. It's so good. And we were talking about philosophy and time. And when you spoke about Luke going into the cave and facing his father, we were to add to that, we were saying that, we're kind of ghosts of our fathers, like, and it transcends our time. And I just wanted to bring that part up because I do feel that sometimes the shadow is those who came before us that are still on us that
Sure.
we're trying to work with.
Well, and that's the Jungian collective unconscious, right? It's everything that's come before us that we have as a part of us in some way, because we all are part of that collective unconscious. And so, I mean, I don't have any family who lived through the Holocaust. Luckily, my family came to the United States before World War II. But that doesn't mean that my history, my heritage as a Jew, doesn't include some trauma from those kinds of events, because Jung would argue that's part of the collective unconscious.
Yeah, I would argue that trauma has affected everybody.
I
and
think
it's,
so.
it's
on a human level.
On a human level. And part of it is because we don't really address it. It seems like, it's like we don't want to admit, which brings us back to pride.
Right.
It's what is it about this thing, pride, that makes us so fearful?
Well, it's interesting because pride, the reason why it's the first sin that I address in the book is that traditionally it's been looked at as the source, because pride is the sin of which Adam and Eve are guilty in the Garden of Eden, of trying to be like God. And then again, when you delve further in and go into Paradise Lost and into Catholic theology, sin is also pride is also the sin that Lucifer is guilty of, which causes him to fall from heaven and become Satan. But today it's interesting because, we tell people, be proud of yourself. And that's a good thing. You're like, well, wait a minute. I thought pride was a bad thing. And so what it comes down to really with all of these sins is that none of the 7 deadly sins in and of themselves are bad. They are bad in excess. It is about moderation. So you can be proud of yourself and proud of doing a good job, but it's when you become excessively obsessed with yourself and obsessively obsessed with your own importance, that's when it becomes problematic. And we'll eventually talk about this when it comes to the other sins as well. Because if you go back to Aristotle, Aristotle says pride is the crown of virtues. You're like, wait a minute, pride is a bad thing. And every high school kid will say, well, I learned about hubris, right, from Aristotle. And they're almost sort of two sides of the same coin, right? That the excess of pride then would become hubris. Whereas pride in and of itself, he says it's the greatness of soul. It's the crown of virtues. It should be something that we should celebrate. But I would argue that today we could be proud without being guilty of pride, if that makes any sense. Some philosophers contemporaries have called pride the essential vice, the utmost evil, that it's still at the root of all of our problems. But I think, if you go back and look at C.S. Lewis, somebody like C.S. Lewis, who has some really great stuff to say about pride. He says a proud person has to be better than everybody else. That's a problem. A proud person's never satisfied, and a proud person craves power. And if you want to assess our current state of the world, politically, socially, economically, take those three things and look at the world through that lens. A proud person has to be better than everyone, is never satisfied, and craves power. It sounds like a lot of people we probably know and could name easily, and a lot of them are leaders who, to some extent, have to have a degree of that in their personality in order to be a leader, but it has to be tempered, right? It has to be tempered, and I think that kind of temperance, that's the trick. That's what we're all looking for, the sweet spot, right? We want to be the best that we can without being obnoxious and without being overly meek, right? And so the Hindu Upanishads say, the line between love and hate is like a razor's edge, right? And I love that. I've always loved that image of the razor's edge, walking the razor's edge. And so much of life seems to be about walking the razor's edge.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes I often wonder, when we talk about our leaders, I can't imagine what it's like to be a type of Jeff Bezos character. That how can you not become corrupted when you have so much and everyone around you probably wants something from you and no one sees you as a person. So then you in turn see everybody as a number. It's almost a curse that I really wouldn't wish it on anybody to be that
No.
person. Like I can't imagine how destructive it is to your soul, right?
Oh, it has to be, but part of the problem, I think, is with a lot of folks like that, it is destructive to their soul, but they are so ingrained in a kind of narcissism that they don't see it. They're unable to see it. They can't be objective because they live a completely subjective existence. And it's interesting when eventually we get to talking about the sin of greed. We can talk about somebody like Jeff Bezos, and then we can talk about the bunch of billionaires who have vowed to give away a lot of their money. I think that's really been interesting, especially in the last 2 or 3 years as we've gone through COVID. Jeff Bezos is making more money than anybody can imagine through COVID. He has made out just fine. And we're probably, many of us, guilty of putting money in his pocket. But I think you're right. It does come down to this question of, well, what does that do to your soul? But then for me, all I can do is be concerned about my soul. And so do I continue to buy from corporations that I don't agree with, or from companies which have leaders that I don't agree with? We've seen all these corporations and companies pulling out of Russia and doing business in Russia. There's been so much backlash just in the last 72 hours about the fact that companies like Coca-Cola and McDonald's, I still think, have not said that they're not going to do business in Russia, and a lot of people are very upset about that. They're very upset about that.
Yeah, I wonder what the Russian Orthodox Church has to say about what's going on there. That would be interesting to hear their point of
Yeah,
view,
it
right?
would be very interesting. I think the sad thing is that we don't know a lot about what is being actually reported in the news. I was reading an article, I think it was in the New York Times yesterday, and they were talking to some citizens in Moscow, and apparently they didn't even know about the invasion because Russia's controlling the media entirely, and now Putin passed that law against spreading false information, whatever that means. And so I think a lot of the citizens they don't even know what's going on. So it would
It's
be
kind of
interesting to hear what the Russian Orthodox Church has to say about this. But we can look back and see what the Catholic Church did during the Holocaust. Not much. So it's hindsight's 2020. And it's difficult when you're living through something to be able to figure out what the right thing is to do, because these are really complicated moral questions. I mean, thankfully, places like Poland have been receiving refugees with open arms. But this is a humanitarian crisis that's brewing, and I don't know what's going to happen eventually. I mean, it's so sad as someone who has studied the Holocaust and taught the Holocaust to see these images of people, trying to cram onto trains in Kiev to try to get out of the Ukraine and get across the border into Poland. And my gosh, if that doesn't look like what happened during the Holocaust, I don't know what does.
Yeah, I think maybe you could say that a lot of what's happening in the Middle East look like the Holocaust. I
Sure,
think that what we're seeing in Kiev is a lot of what we didn't get to see in the Middle East. And,
true,
it just, there's so much tragedy around the world. And my heart goes out to every one of these people that are just struggling to survive in this steamroller of an economy that's coming over. And I think it brings us back to pride, which
sure.
in a really amazing point that when I was reading the chapter on pride was this idea of how it affects the subject object relationship. That to me is amazing. Can you tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're talking about subjectivity and objectivity, right? And my ability to be objective about myself, which is extraordinarily difficult. And that is one of the kind of the goalposts on the way to Jungian individuation is the ability to look at yourself objectively. It's almost impossible because we see everything through a subjective lens. I mean, I view the world through my eyes. That's the only eyes I have. And so I have to hope that others around me will either be honest and frank enough with me to point things out, but then it's up to me to take that and do something with it. And that might be through contemplation, through meditation, through therapy, to explore aspects of myself that, they're kind of ugly, but you got to deal with them because otherwise they just get worse. And so some of that is about the difference between objective self and subjective self. And this is something which philosophers have been dealing with for a long time. It borders on discussions about perspective and how I see the world. How do I see the world? Do I see the world and do I see every human being as inherently evil, inherently good? What is my view of existence and humanity? Because that in many ways is going to reflect on me and how I'm going to react to folks. It's the simple things, isn't it? It's the most simple things. Do you hold the door open for somebody? Right? Do you help somebody out if they've dropped some things in the street? Do you help them pick it up? Recently, I've seen this series of videos that have been showing up on TikTok. My daughter got me onto TikTok. It's a black hole. I got to tell you, you go down, you go in it, and you come out, and it's like 2 hours of your life are shot. But there's this series of videos where somebody walks up to a person in what looks like a supermarket and says, I don't have any money, but I'm really thirsty. Can you buy this bottle of water for me? And they've got their grocery cart full of stuff they're about to check out. And the person in every video gives the person the dollar for the water or whatever it is. And in response, that person says, well, I'm going now, it's a come on, and says, I'm going to pay for all your groceries. And the person said, well, why? And it was because, well, you're willing to help somebody else out. Someone then should help you out. I mean, some of it's that kind of goofy pass it along thing that people do at Starbucks, which, quite honestly, if you do that, you're better off putting money in the tip jar because the baristas could use it. If people are in line at Starbucks, they can already afford their coffee. Help the baristas out instead. So I think so much of this and so much of the book is about how we treat each other as human beings, how we exist. And of course, in the last 2 years during COVID, we have been challenged to the max. Now, the book was finished before COVID. I call the COVID years now like the lost weekend because the book came out right before COVID. And so I haven't had a chance to really do much with it. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity with you, George.
Yeah, are you kidding me? I am grateful for it too. I think, getting back to there's a reason that things happen. I think your book it was like, hey, hang on a second. We're going to need this. We're going to need this book in 2 years. So just hold on, it's coming. Because I think that there's so much great information in here and it's so dense. It's like I said, it's to everybody listening to this. The book is called 7 Deadly Sins. Do yourself a favor and pick it up because it's one of the books you can read through. I've already read the first chapter multiple times and I keep taking new notes and writing stuff down. And, just to stay on the topic of the subject object relationship.
Yeah.
You bring up a lot of, I think it really shows your expertise to talk about maybe the early years of spirituality and religion. And you bring up a lot of mystics from the medieval times.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, do you think maybe the reason that the definitions of pride have changed is because the English language and the subject-object relationship has changed through the time?
To be sure. And I think what has also changed is the way that we understand ourselves and other people. Early on in the history of literature, for example, if you read 12th century French romances, Arthurian romances like Chrétien de Troyes, they're pretty much the first things that really delve into character. Before that, the stories are, George went here, George went there, George killed this guy, George got into a battle. It was very sort of see-spot run. Chrétien de Troyes is the first one who really sort of starts to delve into what does character mean? What is the interior? What does our interior look like? And without that, I mean, we wouldn't have somebody like Hamlet. We wouldn't have Harry Potter, right? Who is able to really look within and study himself and share that with the reader. You don't get that prior to about the 12th century French romance genre. And I think by the time we get to something like the 14th century mystics, like Richard Rolle and Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich and Walter Hilton, the English mystics, and then on the continent in Europe, people like Meister Eckhart, so there are others. But by the time we get to them, they have fully now been invested in studying the self as an object and the self as a subject in its relationship with the divine. And so, there's a great line in Richard Rolle's book called The Fire of Love, which is essentially a memoir. And he's recalling a situation where he really he was guilty of pride. He became too big for his own britches, my grandmother would say. He really became self-important. And a woman really chastised him. And it forced him to kind of withdraw, pull back, and really think about what he'd done. And the line in the English translation is, when I came to myself. And in the original Latin, it's interesting because the Latin word for myself is actually one word, and you have to parse it out. But when I came to myself, and I think that that's just so intriguing that he was able to pull back and really look at himself as an object from an objective perspective and come to his self and realize, you know what? I was a bit of a twit and I shouldn't have done that. And I was really guilty of the sin of pride, of being more important than I am, or thinking I'm more important than I am. And I think so many of us are guilty of that today. And there's always that danger of thinking we are more important than we really are, right? I mean, we have all these phrases, right? Oh, he thinks he walks on water, right? I mean, and we apply it all the time. So we've got a lot going on in the world, and part of that, I think, as I discuss in other parts of the book, we can chalk up to a an increasing focus on technology, and with that, then an inability to take any time to actually do that contemplation and that reflection, where we disconnect, where we're not connected to our phone, where we shut off the computer and we shut off the TV. And it's difficult to do, because, I mean, the studies have shown in psychology that we get dopamine hits from these things, right? We get a high from these things. And so it's difficult because it becomes addictive. But it is so important for us to take a moment to stop and reflect on who we are, what's going on, what can I do? And you can't do that in the midst of what David Shanks once called data smog, right? Where you've just got all of this incoming data and it's this a whirlwind of things going on, and there's no time. And so that's probably partially responsible for the incredible growth we've seen in the last few years in people engaging in meditation, right? I mean, how many meditation apps can you download now? Ironically, right? But I've got a good friend who is a Cistercian monk, a Trappist monk in Massachusetts, and they constantly have people coming to visit to do retreats. People want to have that opportunity to kind of shut down, and it gives them the opportunity, I think, to become more thoughtful people, right? Full of thought. We tend to be rather thoughtless in the way we operate on a day-to-day level, and we're partially to blame. But the world that we have built around us ain't helping.
Yeah, I couldn't agree any more. I I'm a big fan of Mircea Eliade, and he talks about the terror before the sacred. And when my daughter was going through COVID, and I'm willing to bet most parents with young kids felt the same way. My daughter's 7, so she was 6 and trying to Zoom and do all this
Yeah.
stuff. And you know what what I came to the conclusion of after reading Eliade during that time was like, there's no felt presence of the other. And that's so important to have. Like when you talked about reflection, like how else can you see yourself, your mistakes, your pride? How else can you see the good and the bad in you unless there's someone to reflect it back at you?
Well,
And,
and I think you're right, but I also think it is possible to conduct that kind of inner study, in solitude, with the guide of those who've come before us. So you probably have guessed from reading the book, George, that I'm a book fanatic. I have more books than I can count. My library is huge. And I'm thinking about, you want to go off into the woods like
yeah, I love to.
you know some folks have done, then go off into the woods. But but maybe bring Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises with you, right? And he'll guide you. It's a guidebook on how to conduct spiritual exercises. Now it's intended, granted, the Jesuits do it with a person directing you, but there are lots of guides like that from the Desert Fathers, if you want to go back centuries, from medieval mystics who have done this kind of work where they have essentially cut themselves off from the world in order to edify their spirituality, their souls. Julian of Norwich did it. I wouldn't recommend becoming an anchorite these days. Some people do, but that's a pretty tough existence. But there are ways to do it. I have a good friend from high school who's an artist living in Paris now. And once a year, for a month, she goes on what she calls a Facebook sabbatical. She posts a note on Facebook and says, I'm gone for the next month. Don't contact me here because I'm not logging on. And I got a little respect for that. If you're a daily user of Facebook, that's a difficult thing to do. But I think it shows how reliant we are on these things. And you talk about your daughter. My daughter is 18, and I've been observing college students for over 30 years, and oh my gosh, they are connected to their phones in ways that there is no way this is healthy. But part of it is we can't be the old fogies who say, oh, well, you really should, go read a book. Because that's not the world that they're growing up in. That's not the world they live in. Many years ago, a dean said something to me which was incredibly impactful, so much so that I'm repeating it now. It's stuck with me. I was teaching Introduction to Philosophy in South Dakota. And I saw, George, somewhere along the line, you were reading a lot of Nietzsche. And when I taught the course, I modeled it on the course that I took when I took Introduction to Philosophy at Fordham, which was a deep dive into several philosophers. It wasn't a survey. So we read all of one of Nietzsche's works. We read, all of, one of David Hume's work. And I set the course up like that, and it was a disaster, an absolute disaster. And a dean said to me, David, they're not you. And that has stuck with me. They're not. My daughter is not me. Your daughter is not you. They're living in a different time. The world is a completely different place from what we remember. And we can remember that fondly and try to pass that along to them. But expecting them to be updated versions of us is foolhardy. It's interesting. I mean, I was born 2 weeks to the day before Kennedy was shot. My father was a little older when he had me. And so as a result, I've always felt like I had one foot sort of back in the era that my father grew up in, and then one foot in the 60s and 70s. And it's interesting because I'll talk to people, and as a result, my references are all over the place. And I think a lot of that, and I thank my father for that. I mean, if it weren't for my father, I wouldn't have been introduced to Benny Goodman, right? My father saw Benny Goodman when he was a kid and loved Benny Goodman, and he played the Carnegie Hall concerts for me when I was a kid, and oh my God, that was the greatest thing. But I'm not him. And kids today are not us. And I think we need to acknowledge that the world has changed. Maybe it hasn't changed from our perspective in a better way, but we can't do anything about that. And we can't hide our kids away in a closet and try to protect them from a dangerous world as much as we want to. We are doing them no favors when we do that. And so I always found it odd when parents would say, I've got middle school kids and I don't allow them on social media and I only allow them to watch TV for 2 hours a day. I'm like, okay, do you realize that when they get to college, they are going to be the oddballs? They're not going to understand any of the pop culture references. They're not going to have the same frame of reference as their colleagues do. Now, you could say, okay, who cares? Maybe that's not such a bad thing. But we have to be a part of the world that we live in. I would love to shut off the news and not hear any more about what's going on in Ukraine. But that would be ignorant. And the root word of ignorant is ignore, right? I know it's there, but I choose to ignore it. Talk about pride, right? I mean, there's pride, right? I'm above that. I don't need to know about that. Those people, they're suffering. Oh, well, that's their problem. I'm above their problems. I'm not a human being.
In some ways, though, like if I could just push back on that for a moment, like what isn't it kind of prideful to think that we can do anything to help them, and we have so many people here that need our help?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's always that conundrum, right? And people will say, well, we should help the people in our backyard first. And they may be right. And maybe shame on us for not realizing that sooner and not helping the people in our backyard sooner. I think the fact of the matter is be we need to be humane. So let me reframe that in the time that we have here, George. So I'm
Sure.
not talking necessarily about helping people in monetary ways or helping people even in necessarily intangible physical ways. I mean, sure, I would love to get on a plane today and fly to, Kiev and help people at that train station. I don't know what I can do. I would love to do that, but I also am aware enough that I really can't be any help there. So what can I do? Well, I can look to places where maybe they need funding to help, and I can do that from my backyard as well. I can look to reaching out to people I know. I have a colleague here who is from Ukraine. Her family is in one of the towns which has been under siege, and I reach out to her almost daily to say, checking in with you, how you doing? It's that humanity that we seem to have in some ways lost, and that is just incredibly sad. That we have we've lost our ability in some ways to treat each other as human beings. I don't know if we forgot how to do it, if technology got in the way, and certainly, as you say, I mean, the 2 years of being on Zoom calls through COVID certainly didn't help the kids, because there was no relating to human beings. And we're seeing it already as the kids come back to school, that there are different kinds of issues popping up now, not only in their intellectual development, but in their maturation, in their personal development and how they relate to people. So, this bit about, let's think about each other as human beings. And as you said earlier, not as numbers,
Hmm.
not as this faceless bunch. Last night I was watching CNN and they were showing that train station in Kiev, and they were showing these kids sitting in the train, with their faces pressed up against the windows. I mean, how terrifying. But then Sunday I did a virtual tour of Auschwitz
Hmm.
online, and the presenter showed us photos of Polish Jews getting on trains, little kids with yellow stars sewn onto their coats, and it was the same photo, the same picture that I saw of people on that train in Kiev. We're humans. And so if we can get away from the labeling, if we can get away from the pigeonholing and just say, you know what, you're another human being, and that's how I'm going to relate to you. I don't care about your belief system. I don't care about your nationality. I don't care about what you look like. You're a human being, and so am I. We would do well to take our cue from dogs and cats and see the way that cats treat each other and dogs treat each other, and the way that dogs and cats that aren't even related will nuzzle up against each other. We need
Yeah.
more.
Don't you think though that like if we want to treat each other like human beings, and the media shows pictures of the Holocaust and then the Ukrainians, aren't they trying to show the division? Like we're not human. Like this is one group and this is the other group. Like that's the opposite of seeing each other as equals. It
I
just
think
continues that divide.
but I think what they're trying to do, and I don't want to get into the mind of the media because
I know it's
talk about a
toxic.
dangerous place. But I think that the ultimate goal there is to show us about what power unchecked looks like, and how
Hmm.
that affects all people. There have been several terrific books written just in the last couple of years on tyranny,
Yeah.
and the dangers of tyranny, political tyranny, philosophical tyranny. I've been reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. Arendt was the reporter at the Nuremberg trials and the great philosopher. And it's an incredibly dense read about political theory. and the dangers of a tyrannical society. And, if we're not living through that right now, I don't know who did. We are living through a tyrannical situation in Ukraine. And I was saying to a friend of mine the other day, and I don't want to walk over the line here and get too political, but what's happening now in Russia with Putin was the danger of what would have happened if Donald Trump had been elected to a second term. It would have been power unchecked and just an ego unchecked, and both figures who are incredibly guilty of the worst kind of pride possible, which again is that excessive preoccupation with the self and one's self-importance.
Man, that is a lot to think about. It is a lot to think about.
That's why I don't sleep well.
Well, I'm glad. I want to be mindful of your time, Doctor. We're
Sure.
almost in an hour, and I'm sure you have some things you got to handle. But I want everybody to know that this is a phenomenal book, and Dr. Solomon and I are going to be back, I think, next Tuesday at the same time, and we're gonna cover more of them. Like I really hope everybody goes out and just pick the book up. It's 7 Deadly Sins by Dr. Solomon. It is well worth the read. You will learn a lot about where the ideas of sin came from, where they're going, and if you pick it up now, you can talk to us about what you think and ask us questions, and all of
Absolutely.
Dr. Solomon's links are below. And is there anything you want to leave us with? Where can people find you, and what would you like to leave us with?
Sure. Well, my website is davidasolomon.com, and Solomon is spelled Salomon. I may have the wisdom of Solomon, but I don't have the name. And all of my work is up on that page, and links to my blog and links to other things. And I guess I could tease next week and say we're going to talk about lust.
Yes, I'm so excited for it. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I feel like I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed the book, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you again. I hope you have a phenomenal day.
Thanks so much.
And your family's doing well. Thank you so much for everything.
You as well. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.